I haven't been well recently, and I'm going to explain the reason why, and I'm also going to explain a few things that I want to put out a disclaimer straight off that I am not a medical professional. This is basically what I've been told in my area from medical professionals that I have basically corresponded with, because it's always the best point of call. So if you have a similar issue to what I'm about to discuss with you, then I would always recommend your first point of call being your medical professionals that deal with your care, to make sure that things are safe for your particular health conditions and your particular circumstances. So for those that know me quite well, they will know that near Christmas I became quite poorly with two different types of infections from my throat. Now, you all know that I suffer with laryngeal reflux as well as gastroesophageal reflux. And as a result of the laryngeal reflux, or LPR as it's also known, or silent reflux, whichever way you want to call it, I refer to it as LPR, it can react with peptins in your throat, causing croakiness of your voice, inflammation, things like that. So things like something as simple as singing along with the radio can cause me to get a sore throat, and it can then become to the point where it will cause a chest infection at some stage. Now that is my particular situation. I have no tonsils, although I can still get tonsil stones, which is very odd. But I had this dual infection, and I also had a tonsil stone back in December. The infection lasted for 4 weeks, and because it was Christmas, and because obviously COVID was so high and prevalent at the time as well, I didn't want to inundate doctors and hospitals with having this infection, or out of hours doctors, because everyone was so overstretched, and they still are. And obviously doctors are very hard to come by, so I thought it would just go away on its own. I thought it was just something that was minor. However, it got to the point where my breathlessness was becoming worse, and it also became harder for me to bring up what was getting trapped, and it was causing the throat stuff to kind of affect the chest. Now, I'm asthmatic. I take a very strong dose inhaler to help prevent any asthma attacks and stuff. It's usually recommended that if you still have a cough or a sore throat or something wrong with your chest, within 2 weeks to get it investigated to make sure that it's nothing more serious. So after 4 weeks, I still was no better. So I contacted the doctor, and we're talking about mid to late January, around about the 20th of January, something like that. I contacted the doctor. I explained the situation. So they gave me a 10-day course of antibiotics. I had that 10-day course of antibiotics, and then straight after, and when I say straight after, I mean literally the morning after that last dosage of my penicillin V antibiotic for that 10-day course, I woke up with a very, very bad UTI, urinary tract infection, for those that didn't know what UTI was. And I ended up back on antibiotics again but this time a different type of antibiotic to help with the UTI for another 7 days. So I had an infection for 4 weeks, then I got another infection straight after, and I was on antibiotics for 17 days. Now, 2 weeks after that, the kids broke up from school on a Friday, and it was the half term, and my son became very poorly on the Monday, first day off of school. He was fine in the morning, and then by late afternoon he was starting to spike a fever. Naturally, the first thing I thought was COVID, so we did a COVID test. I didn't put a face covering on or anything because I just presumed that he just was a little bit under the weather. It was quite a warm day, and when I say warm day, I mean I'd had the heating on, so I just presumed maybe because he'd been laying in bed, that's why his temperature was up, and I didn't think anything of it. I did his COVID test. He coughed at me because obviously putting it down the throat, they naturally cough as a reflex, and I prayed to dear God that he was negative, and his test did actually come back negative. However, by about 6-7 o'clock at night, he started developing a rash, so I decided it was best to get him checked out by the doctor. I took him to the out of hours doctors, and again I explained to them that his COVID test was negative, and they said that it'd probably be safe to get PCR anyway, just to be on the safe side, but it shouldn't, if it's negative on the lateral flow, chances are it's negative PCR, but it's still always best to keep it safe, especially with the prevalence of problems in our house with health. So I said that's fine. The next morning I woke up and decided, because he was going for a PCR, I would do another lateral flow on him anyway. Now at the time it was guidance that you do a test daily if you have symptoms to see whether you are testing positive or not. And after 5 days, if you're still testing negative, then you should be in the clear. Obviously that's not the rule anymore, but at the time that was. So I tested my son again and his test came back positive. Of course, straight away my heart sank and I thought he coughed at me. Chances are I'm going to catch this infection. I was spraying the house, I was disinfecting the house. I was spraying like Dettol sprays and everything around, and they can get on my chest anyway, because my chest is very sensitive, so is my throat. So when I started with a bit of a sore throat on the Wednesday, my test was still coming back negative, but I didn't think anything of it because my tests were negative, and obviously, you know, I was spraying a lot of stuff around. Then by Thursday evening, my chest was very tight and my throat just seemed to be getting worse. And obviously I'd not long got over a dual throat infection. I was thinking, not again, like this can't be happening. Again, my test was still negative, so I wasn't worried about COVID at this point. It'd been at least 3 or 4 days I'd been around my son and I hadn't got COVID, and I thought I'm getting closer to the end goal of chances are I won't catch it. So anyway, Friday morning I woke up, still felt 10 times worse, did the COVID test and the line appeared straight away, and it turned out I had COVID. Naturally I locked myself away in my room. I'd been doing that anyway, just because I wanted to make sure the rest of my family stayed safe. But I locked myself away in my room and I spent about 14 days, I'd say about 10 to 12 days, in my room, in bed, sleeping between 98 and 99% of the time. But my infection got so bad because obviously I hadn't long recovered from a dual throat infection that my lungs hadn't had a chance to repair themselves from that. And I ended up with aspirating on phlegm and things like that, to the point where I had to contact the doctor and let them know what was going on, and that I was having a hard time getting this thick gloopy stuff off my throat and I was choking on it. And they asked me what my saturations were and I explained that they were between 90 and 92. And I got told that I should be in hospital, and I said no, they're already overstretched, they don't need me. I literally live around the corner. If I get worse, I'll go in. If they drop below 90, I promise I'll go. And they were like, but you should really be there with your health. And I was like, it's fine. I'd rather stay at home. I'm more comfortable in my own room. I'm staying away from family. Plus, if I go, my brother would have to take me and that puts him at risk. I said, and at the moment, I need him to look after my kids. At this point, what I didn't know is that my eldest daughter had caught COVID as well, but she didn't know because her test for some reason was still coming back negative and she wasn't testing as much as she probably should have been. And she was doing assessments for college, so I don't really know what happened with that, but I was in my room, so I wouldn't have known anyway. But in total, I ended up on antibiotics again because the doctor could tell that I was getting worse. Chances are I was going to get pneumonia, and obviously he wanted to fulfill my wishes of allowing me to stay out of hospital. He put me on another 10-day course of penicillin V, and basically told me to take it 4 times a day. Now, because I was sleeping pretty much all of the time, my breathing was very shallow. I was sleeping a lot, and Phil would come in and to check on me to see if I needed anything, obviously fully PPE'd up, and he would have to physically check that I was breathing because I wasn't making a noise, I wasn't moving, I was literally just sleeping a lot of the time. He was very worried, and it made it hard. I was basically waking up, taking meds, going back to sleep. That was pretty much what I was doing. And it got to the point where I couldn't take my antibiotics 4 times a day. So I was doing it 3 times a day, but I couldn't get the 4th dose in because I was just too tired. And And obviously I suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome anyway, with having Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that has been made a hell of a lot worse since I've had COVID, and I've still had this niggly cough and like all of these other chesty issues since having COVID. But cut a long story short, I ended up with probably about maybe 7-day course if you take one tablet twice a day of penicillin V. But obviously I had it left over. So after my COVID ended, I think it took about 16 days, maybe slightly more, for me to actually get a negative test. Obviously I was allowed out of isolation after 10 days in my own home, but I didn't leave the house, and I was still wearing masks until I got my negative test. But it took a long time for me to get a negative result. I was the worst in the house for COVID. I was very ill with it. And like I said, I still have after effects now from long COVID. I'd say about a month later, I started with the throat problem again. And obviously I still had some antibiotic left. So rather than contact the doctors again, which is a nightmare to get hold of as it is, even now, I decided just to take the antibiotics that I had, and that kind of put it at bay for a bit. Obviously the doctors know about this now, but they didn't at the time. And then about a week ago, I started again with my throat. I lost my voice, my throat was very sore. It just hit me all at once. I was fine one day, the next day I just wasn't. Straight away again, because obviously the new strains of COVID that are around, naturally I thought, is it COVID? But I thought it can't be. The only person that's been in my house is my irrigation nurse, and I've barely left my home other than to take my son to school, and I'm outdoors and I stay away from people. But after about 2 or 3 days, I was like, it's getting on my chest, and I know I'm going to end up very poorly by the end of the week. So I contacted the doctors again, and I got a telephone consult. In order to contact my doctors, I have to fill out a clinic form online, tell them roughly what's wrong, and then they designate a slot for you, either by telephone, Zoom call, or ask you to go in and see them. For me personally, despite writing that I was struggling to talk, they gave me a telephone consultation. So he had a hard time hearing me, because the line wasn't that great anyway, and the doctor was also on his last day of quarantine from having COVID himself. So when I was discussing things with him, I said to him, I've not got COVID. I've done like 2 tests, the last one being this morning. I said, but it's not COVID. I said, and I didn't think it would be anyway. I said, because I've not been around anyone with COVID. He literally came back at me with, I don't believe that for a second, because everyone seems to be having it at the minute. And I just turned and said, look, I know I haven't been around anyone with COVID because I've only had appointments in my house for the last 2 weeks, and the only people that I live with have all been healthy. I said, we test regularly. I said, it's fine. I said, I know I've not been in contact with anyone because I've not left my house in over 2 weeks. I said, other than to take my son to school. I said, so I know for a fact I've not been in contact with anyone. It was like he was trying to put his frustrations on me, and I just wasn't having that. Anyway, he decided to ask me, had I ever put steroid medication down my feeding tube. And obviously I've not had my feeding tube for very long, and the last feeding tube I had, I wasn't on steroid medication. So I explained to him no, but I was having trouble swallowing tablets, and I still am, because I take tablets regularly. Some of them are slow releasing, which are no for down feeding tubes anyway. And I explained to him that there's only certain medication that I can put down my tube, and I wasn't sure whether I could do this. So he said to me, I'm going to give you steroids because obviously you've had a lot of these infections lately, and hopefully it'll help with the inflammation and everything else. He said, but I'll give it you as soluble tablets, which means that they dissolve in water. Try taking them orally. If you can't manage that because it's like not helping you, or it's making you feel like you're going to be you're feeling nauseous or anything, and there's a risk if you're bringing your tube up, then I can't see it being a problem putting down your tube. So I turned around and said thanks, and got off the phone. And he did say to me that I could speak to another doctor later on in the day if I wanted to be seen, to see whether I needed antibiotics, because in order to be given antibiotics you have to be seen. So I asked to be seen by a doctor. That was the whole point of me contacting them in the first place. So anyway, he decided to put me in with a doctor that afternoon, and the doctor I saw in the afternoon was amazing. He basically said to me that, you've had quite a few of these infections over your lifetime. You've had quite a few recently. we know that you've had COVID, we know that you've got asthma, you know your body better than anyone. I'm going to go with what your instinct is on this, like, because you know your body best. And I explained to him that, yes, I may have been there a bit earlier and there may not be much sound on my chest or whatever, but I know if I left it till, say, now, before I contacted the doctor, I would be literally choking on phlegm that I couldn't get up. It'd be seriously on my chest right now. And I explained to him about the problems that I've had since having COVID, and I explained about the saturation rates and them being so low. And what he told me was, having asthma when you have COVID can be corrected. So therefore you get given the steroid treatment, you get given oxygen or whatever to basically help reverse any damage that's done from COVID and your asthma when you have COVID, if that makes sense. So your asthma complications can be reversed or kept on top of with saturations being as low as what mine was, because mine was as low as 90. Had I been in hospital, I would have been on the right treatment to basically help with that inflammation, help with all of that problem. But because I chose not to go to hospital and the doctor at the time didn't give me steroid medication, they just gave me antibiotics, I've had a lot of inflammation in my chest. I've had a lot of my body's completely run down, and because obviously my chronic fatigue has got 10 times worse since having COVID in the first place, my body just can't recuperate and just can't correct itself. So he said it's a good thing that the earlier doctor had given me steroids, because he said it would help with the inflammation and everything. And then he said to me about, can I take tablets? And I explained to him that I'm struggling to take tablets, they were getting stuck. So he said he was going to give me a solution of penicillin V for the next 7 days. And then again said to me to take it orally, and I asked about the tube, and he said it might be able to go down the tube. I honestly couldn't give you that indication, but if you feel it, you have to, then you can. But obviously that is not a definitive yes, and it's not a definitive no. So I wanted to find this information out. So I went to the chemist, I collected the prednisolone. I'd already asked the pharmacy. They didn't know, they told me to ask the doctor. The doctor didn't know for sure. So I came home a bit deflated. I took the medication orally and it made me super nauseous. Now, the problem with gastroparesis and the fact that my stomach doesn't work very well anyway is the main benefit is the fact that I have to try and keep my tube down. If I happen to do something like be sick and bring my tube up, I'd have to wait a while to be fitted into endoscopy to then get it refitted, because it's not like a gastric tube that I could probably insert into my stomach again by measuring it from my nose to my stomach. It goes past my stomach into my bowel, so it has to be fitted by a professional. I can't do it myself. So it's about getting that balance of what benefit outweighs the risk and so forth. So I'd asked online, could I do these medications down my tube, and a lot of people came back and said that they put medications down their tube. As long as you're doing your flushes, it should be okay. There is a bit of controversy over crushed tablets versus solutions and stuff like that, but it should be okay. But obviously to speak to medical professionals, and I explained that I had tried, but nobody seemed to know the answer. So anyway, 24 hours later, up to 48 hours it took me in total to get the final answer for this, which I'm going to tell you because this video is kind of like going on a bit. So after a lot of talking around with 3 doctors, a dietitian and 2 pharmacists, I finally got the answers to this. So with enteral feeding, which is what's known as feeding via a feeding tube, enteral feeding with prednisolone can be done together as long as they're soluble. Now, obviously, the first protocol for any steroid medication would be for anybody on enteral feeding is to be given either a hydrocortisone injection of steroid every day, which obviously isn't suitable for someone who has a respiratory issue. They need it in the system properly, or they can have it as soluble tablets. Now, mine are soluble tablets that you can mix with 20 mils of water. They are to be given with food, so therefore you can stop your feed halfway through, flush your flush this tube, make sure that there's no feed left in it, then give you medication, flush it again, and then basically reconnect your feed back up if you're in the middle of feeding. If you're not in the middle of the feeding and you've only just finished your feed, then you can literally take your medication after flushing your tube, take your medication, then flush your tube again, as soon as you finish your enteral feeding, and that's fine. The penicillin V is a little bit more tricky. The penicillin V can actually be put down as a solution, not as a tablet. It can be put down your feeding tube. However, with enteral feeding, it is a little bit complicated because they can counteract each other. So more so the feed can counteract the medicine more than the medicine can counteract the feed. So basically what can happen is the nutrients from the feed can interact with the medicine and cause the medicine to not be absorbed as well as it should be. Which obviously with a medication like antibiotic, you want it to be absorbed as well as you can possibly hope for. But there is a 30 to 80% chance that the absorption will be less than what it should be should you take it with food. So the idea is that you take penicillin V on an empty stomach, but obviously mine's bypassing my stomach because it goes past my stomach into my jejunum. But obviously if I was attached to feed, I would have to wait an hour after stopping that feed before I could take that medicine, because I have to make sure that my digestive tract is empty from feed before I take that medicine, or 2 hours prior to going on feed. So at the end of the day, you can put the medicine down your tube, but you have to do it 2 hours prior to your feed or an hour after finishing. Obviously this is just my area, my criteria for me, for my health issues. This is not something that you should be doing lightly. This is something that you should be discussing with your own medical team, like I said. But if you have any issues whatsoever, or you're new to this, like I was with putting medicines down my tube, always discuss it with your medical providers. But that is the basis of the answer. I hope that at some point the steroids will kick in and hopefully I won't get as many of these infections anymore. But we'll see. And obviously, as always, please be safe, because COVID is still running around and doing its rounds, and it's actually becoming more transmissible. So try and wear your masks where you can, and it'll prevent things like this from happening to people like me and to people that you care about that are vulnerable. But yeah, take care. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and this is my update. So thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed, please subscribe and like. Thanks, bye.